step back into a time when a simple headache might mean drilling a gaping hole in your skull, where a persistent fever could be cured by draining half your precious blood, and where even a minor cut or scrape was often a terrifying prelude to a slow, agonizing death. Medieval medicine wasn't merely rudimentary. For those who endured its grim ministrations, it was a gauntlet of unimaginable pain, deeply entrenched superstition, and horrifying practices that pushed the very limits of human endurance. Forget the sanitized, romanticized image of the kindly village doctor, patiently applying poultices in a quaint cottage. This was a world where the act of healing often bore an unsettling resemblance to a form of ritualized torture, where the individuals wielding the crude instruments of salvation were as likely to cause profound, lasting suffering as they were to offer any genuine alleviation. The human body, in this bewildering era, was not a marvel of intricate biology, but a vast, terrifying mystery, ripe for brutal experimentation, its inner workings understood only through layers of flawed theory and desperate guesswork. What did ordinary people truly face when the spectre of sickness descended upon them in the so-called Dark Ages? The raw, visceral reality, stripped bare of myth and legend, is far, far grimmer than you have ever dared to imagine. At the very core of medieval medical thought, a theory so utterly pervasive, so deeply, stubbornly ingrained, that it dictated almost every single treatment. Every desperate intervention was the ancient concept of the four humours. This was no fleeting, fringe idea, no whispered superstition among the uneducated. It was, in essence, the undisputed scientific consensus of the era, an inherited legacy from the revered ancient Greek physicians, most notably Hippocrates and the formidable Galen. This venerable doctrine asserted that the human body was a meticulously balanced system of four vital, circulating fluids: the vibrant, life-giving blood, the cool, damp phlegm, the fiery, aggressive yellow bile often associated with choler, and the dark, melancholic black bile. Each of these humours, in a cosmic dance of correspondence, was believed to be inextricably linked to one of the four classical elements: air, water, fire, and earth, and in turn possessed its own unique set of intrinsic qualities, such as hot, cold, wet, and dry. Sickness, in this all-encompassing worldview, wasn't attributed to unseen microorganisms or complex viral invaders, concepts utterly beyond their grasp. It was unequivocally and simply a direct manifestation of an imbalance, an unfortunate excess, or deficiency of these fundamental internal liquids. Imagine, for instance, a patient gripped by a raging fever, their skin burning, their pulse racing. To the medieval physician, this wasn't a viral infection. It was a clear sign of too much blood, an excess of the hot and wet humor, pushing the body into a state of inflammatory disequilibrium. Conversely, a person suffering from profound melancholy, lost in the depths of sorrow and lethargy, was diagnosed with an overabundance of cold and dry black bile. The overarching goal of any medieval healer, whether a university-trained master or a humble village barber surgeon, wasn't to fight a specific disease, entity, or target a pathogen, but rather to painstakingly restore this delicate humoral equilibrium. This fundamentally flawed theoretical framework meant that all treatments, from seemingly benign dietary adjustments to radical life-threatening surgical procedures, were single-mindedly aimed at manipulating and rebalancing these elusive internal liquids. Envision attempting to repair a sophisticated, intricate machine when your entire comprehension of its inner workings, its delicate gears and circuits, is fundamentally, irrevocably wrong. That, in essence, was the bewildering and often tragic predicament of the medieval medical practitioner, a profound misunderstanding that paved the way for some of the most shocking and counterintuitive practices in human history. Asterisk. If the pervasive theory of the four humours dictated the problem, then bloodletting, in its stark simplicity and horrifying ubiquity, was believed to be the ultimate, universally applicable solution. This was not merely one therapeutic option among many. It was the absolute, unshakable bedrock of medieval medicine, applied with astonishing regularity for an almost ludicrously wide spectrum of ailments, from a persistent sore throat to the terrifying ravages of the Black Death, from debilitating mental illness to the natural, delicate process of childbirth. The lancet, the knife, and the leech were deployed with an almost religious fervor. The underlying logic, though chillingly simplistic, was powerfully seductive in its time. If a patient harbored too much bad blood, if a particular humor was in painful excess, or if unseen toxins were believed to be circulating, the most logical, an effective course of action was simply to remove a portion of that life-giving fluid. Patients, already weakened by their illness, would often be subjected to this draining ordeal, bled from carefully selected veins with sharp lancets, crude knives, or, in a more refined technique, by the application of hungry, wriggling leeches. The procedure would often continue until the patient, pale and dizzy, teetered on the brink of unconsciousness, or even completely fainted, a sign believed by some to indicate that enough bad blood had been expelled. Medieval doctors, in their meticulous, though misguided approach, would often consult intricate astrological charts to determine the best and most auspicious time for the procedure, believing that the alignment of celestial bodies directly influenced the ebb and flow of the body's humors. A lunar eclipse, for instance, might be deemed the ideal moment to bleed from the right arm, while a particular planetary conjunction might call for a different approach, perhaps targeting a vein in the foot. The belief in bloodletting was so deeply ingrained in the cultural fabric that even barbers, with their ready access to sharp razors and their visible presence in every town square, naturally evolved into the primary, if untrained, practitioners of this deadly art. This historical connection is, in fact, the very origin of the iconic red and white striped barber's pole, its colors starkly symbolizing the blood and the bandages, the two inescapable realities of this pervasive medieval practice. The consequences for the patient were often devastating. Already battling a weakening illness, they emerged from the bloodletting procedure even more feeble, more susceptible to further infection, and frequently sicker than before. Their already compromised immune systems were further strained by the loss of vital blood. Yet, the belief in the efficacy of bloodletting was so absolute, so unshakable, that any observed failure or worsening of the patient's condition was almost invariably blamed on the patient's inherently flawed constitution, their pre-existing weakness, or even their moral failings, never on the fundamental flaws of the treatment itself. This unwavering conviction, despite repeated evidence to the contrary, stands as a stark testament to the powerful grip of established medical dogma in an era starved of genuine scientific understanding. Yet, the medieval doctor's gruesome arsenal extended far beyond the simple, indiscriminate slicing of veins. To forcibly rebalance those pesky humors, practitioners also employed a range of equally aggressive, profoundly unpleasant, and often terrifying methods designed to induce extreme bodily expulsion. Purging, in particular, was a highly favored technique, achieved through the forced administration of powerful emetics specifically formulated to induce violent, uncontrollable vomiting. Ingredients might range from relatively benign, though still deeply unpleasant herbal mixtures, to truly noxious substances like hellebore, a poisonous plant known for its purgative properties, or even a concoction of various metallic salts. Imagine being already profoundly weakened by illness, your stomach churning, and then being compelled to endure hours of agonizing, involuntary retching, all in the name of cleansing your system of noxious humors. Similarly, harsh purgatives were routinely prescribed to induce extreme and prolonged diarrhea. These could include potent laxatives derived from plants like senna or the notoriously brutal castor oil, often administered in quantities that would make a modern patient recoil in horror. The rationale remained the same: to expel excess humors, to flush out any corrupt or putrefying matter believed to be festering malevolently within the patient's intestines. In addition to oral purgatives, enemas, often made from bizarre and unpalatable ingredients, were frequently administered to cleanse the lower bowel. Cupping, a technique with ancient origins, was another widely popular method for subtly manipulating the flow of humors. This involved heating small, usually glass or horn, cups and then quickly applying them to the patient's skin. As the air within the cup cooled, it created a powerful vacuum, drawing the skin and underlying tissues upwards and bringing a rush of blood to the surface. This was often used to alleviate localized pain, reduce inflammation, or even treat common colds. The idea being to draw out bad humors trapped in the affected area. Sometimes, if a more aggressive approach was desired, the skin beneath the cup would be meticulously scarified, a polite, almost clinical term for pricking or cutting the skin with tiny, shallow incisions, allowing blood to seep out and accumulate within the cup, effectively transforming the treatment into a gentler, more localized form of bloodletting. Herbal remedies, of course, formed a significant and omnipresent part of the medieval healing landscape. These were not always the gentle, comforting concoctions one might imagine. While many did possess genuine medicinal properties, their application was often a chaotic gamble, and many contained powerful, toxic compounds. Plants like hemlock or belladonna, for instance, known for their potent effects, were sometimes used as sedatives or pain relievers. However, the precise dosage was poorly understood, and incorrect administration could easily lead to paralysis, terrifying hallucinations, or even death. Furthermore, medicines were often made from truly bizarre and unsettling ingredients, including dried animal parts, powdered stones, or even human excrement, reflecting a blend of folk wisdom, genuine observation, and deeply superstitious beliefs. The sheer volume of ineffective treatments, combined with the often actively dangerous remedies, paints a vivid picture of a population desperately clinging to any glimmer of hope in the face of relentless suffering and a medical landscape that was, more often than not, utterly baffling and shockingly brutal. When the humors proved stubbornly resistant to draining, purging, or the myriad of other internal manipulations, the medieval patient inevitably found themselves transferred into the rough hands of the barber surgeon. It is crucial to understand that these individuals were distinctly separate from the formally educated, highly esteemed physicians of the era. The physicians, often university trained and versed in Latin texts, largely concerned themselves with abstract theoretical diagnoses, intricate prognostications based on humoral theory, and the prescription of internal remedies. They were the intellectual elite of medicine, rarely sullying their hands with the sciences of actual bodily intervention, in stark contrast The barber surgeon was the gritty, hands-on practitioner, often occupying a decidedly low rung on the social ladder. Their realm was the visceral, the immediate, the painfully practical. They were the ones who performed the gruesome tooth extractions, who bravely or foolishly lanced festering boils, who painstakingly, if often crudely, set broken bones, and, indeed, who undertook the terrifying life-or-death endeavor of major surgeries. Their training was almost exclusively an apprenticeship, passed down through generations or learned on the job by observing and assisting a more experienced master. There was no formal anatomical instruction beyond what could be gleaned from rudimentary diagrams or, very rarely, the observation of a single, often hastily conducted, public dissection. This lack of standardized education meant that their skills were wildly variable, ranging from surprisingly adept in some cases to horrifyingly incompetent in others, often relying more on sheer brute force, a high tolerance for gore, and a terrifyingly steady hand. Their tools were as crude as their methods, rusty, unsterilized saws, often more suited for carpentry than surgery, an array of menacing knives that rarely saw soap and water, and an assortment of forceps and other instruments designed for extraction, cutting, and crushing rather than delicate precision. The very concept of hygiene or antisepsis was utterly non-existent. Wounds, once inflicted, were typically treated with practices that guaranteed infection. They might be packed with unsterile moss gathered from a damp forest floor, with dusty cobwebs found in a dark corner, or, in some truly abhorrent instances, with animal dung, ensuring that any open wound would quickly fester into a virulent, gangrenous horror. A simple cut that, in modern times, would barely warrant a plaster, could swiftly lead to a catastrophic infection, turning a minor injury into an agonizing, protracted march towards a slow, painful death. The barber surgeon's shop, often inconveniently, combined with their regular barbering business, was a place of last, desperate resort, perpetually reeking of blood, sweat, unwashed bodies, and the chilling scent of impending doom. It was a stark, brutal testament to the raw, unrefined nature of medieval medical intervention. Perhaps one of the most viscerally shocking and enduring images of medieval medical barbarity is the practice of trepanning, the audacious, terrifying procedure of drilling, scraping, or cutting a gaping hole directly into the patient's skull. This was far from a rare, experimental, or fringe undertaking. Quite astonishingly, it was a remarkably common and widely accepted surgical intervention performed for a surprisingly diverse array of ailments, most notably severe and persistent headaches, the mysterious and frightening symptoms of epilepsy, and, perhaps most tragically, what was then vaguely understood and collectively feared as madness or mental derangement. The grim underlying belief that propelled this harrowing practice was chillingly simple. By creating an opening, a literal breach, in the hard, unyielding bone of the skull, it was thought that various malevolent entities, whether they be evil spirits, unseen internal pressures exerted by the brain, or indeed an unbearable excess of those pesky humors, could be released, thereby curing the patient of their affliction. Archaeological evidence of trepanning, in fact, dates back to prehistoric times, with human remains discovered globally displaying clear signs of this ancient cranial surgery, testifying to its astonishingly deep roots in human history. Yet, the practice continued with horrifying regularity throughout the entire medieval period, its methods evolving only marginally from their primitive origins. Imagine the scene: a patient, often fully conscious, their senses brutally assaulted, by the agonizing reality of the moment, held down by strong hands, while a crude hand-powered trepan, a sharp-edged drill, or a scraping tool inexorably bit into their skull-bone. The pain would have been utterly unimaginable, a searing torment that pushed the limits of human endurance. The risks, both immediate and long-term, were astronomical. Immediate death from shock or hemorrhage, irreversible brain damage from an errant slip of the tool, or, most commonly, a fatal infection that would inevitably claim the patient within. Days as unsterile instruments introduced virulent pathogens directly into the vulnerable brain cavity. Miraculously, and against all odds, some individuals did indeed survive this harrowing ordeal, their ancient skull fragments displaying clear, undeniable signs of subsequent bone regrowth around the trepanned hole. These survivors, however, were undoubtedly the rare exceptions. For every one who clung to life, countless others must have succumbed to the profound shock of the trauma, the uncontrollable bleeding, or the inevitable septic infections that inexorably followed, leaving behind a grim and silent testament to humanity's desperate, often barbaric, attempts to understand and control the bewildering mysteries of the mind and body. The practice stands as a stark and horrifying symbol of an era where ignorance and superstition held a brutal sway over the fragile realm of human health. When the body suffered grievous injury, a bone shattered, or a festering infection raged, unchecked, metastasizing its poisons throughout the limb. The medieval medical response was often as brutally uncompromising as the affliction itself. Amputations, in this grim context, were a terrifying, last-ditch resort, a desperate measure, enacted to save a life by sacrificing a limb. These horrific procedures were performed almost universally, without any form of effective anesthesia beyond perhaps a copious amount of strong alcohol, a crude opium derivative, or, in a truly desperate attempt at unconsciousness, a blunt blow to the head with a mallet. A limb, perhaps gangrenous from an untreated wound, swollen and blackened by infection, or crushed beyond repair in the savage chaos of battle, would be inexorably sawed off with agonizing slowness. Imagine, if you dare, the chilling scene: a rough, unsterilized saw, its teeth dulled by previous use, tearing through muscle, sinew, and bone with a sickening grind. The patient's screams would have filled the air, a piercing sound of absolute agony, while several strong individuals desperately held them down, their resistance born of sheer, primal terror. The blood loss, immediate and terrifyingly profuse, would often be catastrophic, leading swiftly to death from hypovolemic shock, even if the actual surgery was successful. To stem this torrent of life-giving fluid, medieval surgeons relied on the excruciating practice of cautery, quite literally burning the raw, exposed stump with a red-hot iron. This agonizing method was designed to sear and seal the blood vessels, preventing further hemorrhage, but it simultaneously created a massive, horrifically burned wound that was predictably, exquisitely susceptible to further, often fatal, infection. The odds of surviving such a procedure were, to put it mildly, incredibly low, making amputation a truly final, desperate gamble where the chances of living were slim and the risk of dying, from a myriad of complications, was overwhelming. Beyond amputations, broken bones were crudely, if at all, reset, often leading to permanent deformities, chronic pain, and limited mobility. Hernias, a common and debilitating condition, might be repaired through crude surgical incisions, but the survival rate was abysmal due to the unavoidable internal bleeding and, once again, the rampant, inescapable infection. These were not the operations of delicate, precise modern surgery guided by anatomical knowledge and sterile techniques. Instead, they were raw, unrefined acts of brutal intervention, demanding immense, almost unbelievable, courage from both the suffering patient enduring the torment and the surgeon wielding the crude, often unwashed instruments of their terrifying life or death trade. The very air in these surgical chambers would have been thick with the stench of blood, pain, and the chilling presence of impending doom. The medieval world, stripped of its romanticized veneer, was a terrifying place to exist, not solely because of its incessant wars, devastating famines, or the constant threat of banditry, but primarily due to the ubiquitous, invisible enemy lurking in every shadowed corner. Disease, without even the faintest glimmer of understanding regarding germ theory. The groundbreaking concept that microscopic organisms cause illness, cleanliness, was barely a concept, and public sanitation systems were virtually non-existent. Raw, untreated human and animal sewage flowed openly through the cobbled streets, mingling freely with refuse and waste. Animals, often livestock, roamed unhindered, contributing to the pervasive filth, and water sources, from wells to rivers, were almost universally contaminated with various pathogens. Wounds, as we have already explored, were treated with practices that, far from preventing infection, actively encouraged it, turning minor injuries into festering, life-threatening crises. Early hospitals, though they existed and represented a charitable, if naive, effort, were often more akin to hospices or places of confinement than true medical facilities. Their primary focus was on spiritual comfort and the provision of basic shelter rather than aggressive medical cure. Patients suffering from highly contagious diseases were frequently housed together in close quarters, ensuring the rapid, inevitable spread of illness among the already vulnerable. This catastrophic lack of hygiene, both personal and public, meant that common illnesses like dysentery, a brutal intestinal infection, smallpox, a disfiguring and often fatal viral disease, typhus, a louse-borne epidemic, and tuberculosis, consumption, a chronic, wasting lung disease, swept through populations with devastating, relentless regularity. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, a cataclysmic plague that ravaged Europe and beyond, exposed the catastrophic inadequacy and utter helplessness of medieval medicine in the face of a truly overwhelming biological assault. Doctors and healers at the time tried every conceivable remedy, further rounds of bloodletting, bizarre and unproven herbal concoctions, desperate prayers, and even the visually striking but utterly useless plague masks, beak-like contraptions, filled with aromatic herbs, which, while perhaps making the wearer smell better, did absolutely nothing to stop airborne transmission of the deadly bacteria. The sheer scale of death, the horrifying speed with which the plague spread, and the complete inability of medieval practitioners to halt its advance, laid bare the terrifying reality of their limitations in an era utterly devoid of basic sanitation, effective antiseptics, or any comprehension of microbial life. Even a seemingly innocuous common cold could swiftly spiral into a fatal condition, and large-scale epidemics were the ultimate, brutal, and tragically indiscriminate equalizer of human life. Beyond the physical torments, the medieval world also grappled with the bewildering and often terrifying mysteries of the human mind, leading to treatments that were as horrifying as any physical intervention. Mental illness, a spectrum of conditions ranging from severe, debilitating depression and anxiety to profound psychosis and hallucinations, was rarely, if ever, perceived or understood as a medical condition in the modern sense. Instead, it was far more frequently attributed to malevolent forces such as demonic possession, a direct and severe divine punishment for sin, or in the slightly more scientific but still flawed humoral framework, an extreme and intractable imbalance of the bodies for humors, the so-called cures. For these terrifying afflictions were a disturbing and often cruel blend of religious ritual, superstitious practice, and outright physical violence. Exorcisms, frequently brutal and prolonged affairs, were conducted with the explicit aim of casting out the offending evil spirits believed to be tormenting the afflicted individual. Patients might be cruelly chained, sometimes for extended periods, to prevent self-harm or aggression towards others. They could be subjected to savage beatings, supposedly to drive out the demons, or exposed to extreme physical discomfort through methods like forced immersion in freezing water or prolonged exposure to intense heat, all in a desperate and misguided attempt to shock the malevolent entities out of their bodies. Some terrifyingly misguided theories even posited that extreme starvation or complete sensory deprivation could somehow purify the soul and miraculously restore sanity. Trepanning, as we've already explored in its physical context, was also a depressingly common treatment for mental distress, literally attempting to let the bad or diseased vapors out of the head. While it is true that some monastic orders or charitable institutions did, in rare instances, offer a degree of more compassionate care for the mentally afflicted, often rooted in prayer, quiet contemplation, and a form of gentle restraint, these were by far the exception rather than the rule. For the vast majority of individuals who descended into mental illness in the medieval period, their fate was a terrifying descent into fear, profound isolation, social stigma, and the brutal reality of ineffective, often physically harmful interventions, proving unequivocally that the horrors of medieval medicine extended far beyond the operating table, reaching deep into the very core of human consciousness. In a world where genuine scientific understanding was nascent, rudimentary, and often obscured by superstition, and where disease was a constant, terrifying, and omnipresent threat, desperation naturally cultivated a fertile ground for charlatanism, folk magic, and an unshakable, fervent belief in the divine. Medieval medicine, far from being a coherent discipline, was a bewildering, often contradictory stew of genuine, though frequently misguided medical practices, intricate astrological interpretations, and outright magical thinking. Alongside the gruff barber surgeon and the learned, Latin-spouting university physician, countless charlatans and itinerants roamed the land, peddling their miracle cures and dubious remedies. These opportunistic quacks offered everything from simple, beautifully crafted but utterly useless amulets, worn to ward off the dreaded plague or protect against evil spirits, to powdered unicorn horn, a legendary but non-existent substance believed to confer virility, longevity, and act as a universal antidote. Love potions, promising to mend broken hearts or secure affections, were also highly sought after, blending the physical with the emotional. Pilgrimages to sacred sites across Europe, such as the famed Camino de Santiago, or to local shrines boasting relics of saints, were immensely popular. The devout, crippled by illness or despair, genuinely believed that touching a saint's bone, bathing in the miraculously healing waters of a holy well, or performing acts of penance could cure any physical or spiritual ailment. The Church, in its omnipresent authority, played a massive and often contradictory role in this medical landscape. Prayers, solemn anointing of the sick, and spiritual penance were not merely comforting rituals but were often prescribed alongside, or even in place of, physical treatments. If a patient tragically succumbed to their illness, it was frequently interpreted not as a failure of treatment, but as God's inscrutable will, a sign of their preordained fate, or even a direct consequence of their unconfessed sins. This pervasive blend of the mundane and often dangerous and the miraculous meant that patients, often with little recourse, faced a bewildering and contradictory array of options, some of which might, by sheer chance, be effective, many of which were harmless, and a significant number that were actively dangerous or even fatal. The sheer volume of ineffective treatments, the pervasive presence of unproven remedies, and the desperate yearning for a miracle paint a poignant picture of a population constantly seeking a glimmer of hope in the face of relentless suffering, and a medical landscape that was, more often than not, utterly baffling, deeply inconsistent, and chillingly brutal. Perhaps no single aspect of medieval life more acutely highlights the era's medical horrors and the pervasive fragility of existence than the twin perils of childbirth and the tragically high rates of infant mortality. Bringing new life into the world was not a joyous, celebrated event as it is today, but a perilous, agonizing, and often ultimately fatal journey for both the mother and her tiny, vulnerable child. Without the most basic tenets of modern obstetrics, the concept of sanitary practices during delivery, or any form of effective pain management, women endured hours, and frequently days, of excruciating, prolonged labor, their bodies pushed to the absolute breaking point. Midwives, who were almost invariably the only form of medical assistance available during delivery, were typically women of experience and often advanced age, their knowledge rooted in generations of passed-down wisdom, practical intuition, and, inevitably, a fair measure of folk superstition. They might administer various herbal concoctions, believed to induce labor or alleviate pain, or attempt physical manipulations to aid a difficult birth. However, truly complicated presentations, such as a breech baby, or severe complications like preeclampsia or postpartum hemorrhage, almost invariably ended in tragedy for both the mother and her infant. Infections, particularly the dreaded puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever, caused by the transmission of bacteria during unsterile deliveries, were rampant and claimed the lives of countless new mothers. For the infants themselves, merely surviving the ordeal of birth was only the first challenge in a terrifying gauntlet. The first year of life was a period of extraordinary vulnerability. Diseases like smallpox, measles, whooping cough, and brutal episodes of dysentery, combined with pervasive issues of malnutrition, unsanitary living conditions, and a complete lack of understanding about infant hygiene, led to appallingly high rates of infant and child mortality. It was an unspoken, grim reality that families braced themselves for loss. It was common, heartbreakingly common, for multiple children within a single family not to survive to adulthood. This pervasive and heartbreaking loss meant that mothers, after enduring the agony of childbirth, often faced the additional, profound grief of burying their offspring. While there were extremely rare instances of early crude surgical interventions for severely difficult births, such as rudimentary C-sections, these procedures were almost always fatal to the mother, a desperate and brutal last resort performed only to save the child, highlighting the agonizing choices faced by medieval communities. The sheer fragility of human life, particularly in its earliest and most vulnerable stages, was a stark, brutal, an omnipresent reality that underscored the fundamental limitations and profound dangers of medieval medical knowledge and practice. The long and often horrifying era of medieval medicine, despite its myriad cruelties, profound misunderstandings, and often misguided practices, casts an enduring, sobering shadow, serving as a stark and indispensable reminder of just how far medical science has truly come. From the pervasive, unwavering belief in humoral imbalances that led to the dangerous and indiscriminate draining of blood and the violent purging of the body, to the crude, unsterilized blades wielded by the often lowly barber surgeons, and the truly terrifying life-or-death practice of trepanning a human skull. It was, for those who lived through it, a time of immense, relentless suffering and pathetically limited scientific understanding. Diseases, whether common or epidemic, raged utterly unchecked, sweeping through communities with devastating impunity. Mental illness was almost universally demonized, attributed to malevolent spirits, and treated with brutal, ineffective rituals. And the very act of bringing new life into the world, childbirth, was a daily, terrifying gamble with death for both mother and infant. Yet, within this grim tableau of ignorance and agony, there were, if one looks closely, faint flickers of genuine insight, nascent forms of medical observation, and a powerful, undeniable testament to sheer human resilience. The meticulous, if often misguided, compilation of herbal knowledge by monks and folk healers, the methodical, however flawed observation of symptoms, and the unyielding human spirit in the face of relentless pain all played their part. The very failures of medieval medicine, particularly when confronted with the overwhelming, indiscriminate devastation of the Black Death, unknowingly spurred later generations to question old doctrines, to challenge established dogmas, and to desperately seek out radically new answers. It was a dark, often agonizing chapter in the vast tapestry of human history, born primarily of profound desperation and pervasive ignorance, but one that, paradoxically, in its very brutality and catastrophic shortcomings, inadvertently laid some of the groundwork for the scientific inquiry, empirical observation, and compassionate, evidence-based care that would eventually come to define modern medicine. So, the next time you, a citizen of the 21st century, casually reach for a painkiller to soothe a headache, or undergo a routine checkup with barely a thought, take a moment. Remember the anonymous medieval patient, their body ravaged by illness, their mind clouded by fear, enduring unspeakable torment under the crude instruments of a primitive age. In that reflection, you might just feel a profound and truly overwhelming sense of gratitude for the colossal strides humanity has made, and how far we have truly come from the brutal, terrifying realities of medieval healing.